Hey everybody, welcome back. So there are a lot of different factors that are going to influence your ability to breathe or the amount of air that you move through your lungs. Your size. In general, a larger individual, a taller individual, let's put it that way, is going to have larger lungs, and so they're going to be able to breathe more. They will take in more air at any given time, but they need more air. If you are overweight, then your body needs to take in more air for that reason. So you may breathe heavier because of your weight. Your sex goes with the initial size comment that I made. So females tend to be smaller than males, and so their lungs are smaller than males, which means they're going to get less air crossing their membrane at any given time. Your age. So young infants, young children are going to need to breathe faster to get the same amount of air for their size as someone who is older. And then physical condition. That goes with like if you are overweight, if you have any type of disease, if you have emphysema, if you have any other form of COPD, if you have severe asthma, or if you just have a cold. These are going to influence your breathing also. So let's look at normal breathing. A tidal volume is what we typically move in and out of our lungs with each breath, and that's about 500 milliliters. So if you look here, tidal volume is the small amount right here. So it's just this little bit of air that moves with every given breath. And that's going to be continuous, okay? We do have an inspiratory reserve volume. This is the amount that can be forcibly taken in over the tidal volume. So think about when you are getting ready to jump into a lake when you're swimming and you have to hold your breath. You're going to go and hold your breath and then jump. That extra air that you pulled in is that inspiratory reserve volume. We also have an expiratory reserve volume. This is the amount of air that we forcibly exhale. So think about blowing up a balloon. You go and you blow a balloon up. That forceful expiration is your expiratory reserve volume. And so here again, normal tidal volume. Here we have inspiratory reserve volume, and here is expiratory reserve volume. So the residual volume is the air remaining in the lungs after expiration. So this air does not get removed. And this air actually helps keep the alveoli from collapsing in on itself. So we need that air in our lungs. That's about 1,200 milliliters of air that just doesn't go through the actual ventilation process. And so that's this air down here, that little bit of air that doesn't really enter into our breathing. We have a vital capacity. This is the total amount of air that is exchangeable. So if we look at the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve and expiratory reserve, then we have that total that vital capacity. And so in females, it's about 3,100 milliliters. In males, it's about 4,800. And again, this is due to differences in sizes of these individuals. The dead space air is air that remains in the conducting zones. So dead space air is about 150 milliliters of air, and it just doesn't reach that alveoli. So that's not really part of this because it's not even in here. The total lung capacity, though, is then the vital capacity plus the residual volume. So this is how much air can be held in our lungs at any given time. So we can test these different capacities using a spirometer. And so that's what this cartoon here is showing. It shows what a spirometer does. Basically, you put your mouth around the mouthpiece and then you blow as hard as you can, and it will move this upwards. Another thing you can look for is breathing in. You can put your mouth around the mouthpiece and then you can suck and try and see how far you can push this or pull this, move this up by breathing inwards. So in both cases, you're testing to see either inspiratory or expiratory volumes. There are other factors that can influence air movement. These are not respiratory factors. So coughing or sneezing actually functions to get rid of materials from our lungs. Crying, this can actually increase the amount of air movement. Laughing, hiccuping, and yawning. These all can influence the amount of air being moved, but not associated with actual breathing. And so these are just the mechanisms, and it kind of talks about each mechanism and what happens, okay? That's from your book. So at this point, you should be able to tell me what a tidal volume is, the inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume, residual volume, vital capacity, dead space, other mechanisms that can cause air movement, and what tool we use to measure airflow. All right. So now let's look at external respiration, gas transport, and internal respiration, which are so we've talked about breathing. So now let's look at the other three factors, or the other three parts to the breathing. So once we get air in through pulmonary ventilation, we're then going to exchange gases from our lungs with our blood. And so this occurs in the pulmonary capillaries and in the alveoli. Internal respiration, we're going to have exchange of gases between our blood again, but our body tissues. So these are capillaries of the body, systemic capillaries, and body cells. And gases always move from higher to lower concentration down a concentration gradient via diffusion, but also associated with pressure differences. And so here you can see external respiration, where carbon dioxide is higher in amounts in the capillaries, but oxygen is higher in amounts in the lungs. And so oxygen diffuses down its concentration gradient into the capillaries and then moves through the blood to our tissues, whereas carbon dioxide moves from our blood capillaries into our lungs and then out through the expiration of the body, or when we expire. That sounds bad because expiration, a lot of people think of death. When we exhale, that sounds better. So blood then moves back to the left atrium, goes down to the left ventricle, and then is pumped out into systemic circulation. Once blood gets into the system, again, at the body tissue capillaries, we're going to have higher amounts of oxygen in our blood than in our cells. And so oxygen diffuses from the blood into our tissues down its concentration gradient. Carbon dioxide is being built up in our tissues. So carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the blood capillaries and from a higher to lower concentration. And then it moves back to the right atrium, to the right ventricle, and out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, where we again have gas exchange. So oxygen is loaded into the blood during external respiration. Carbon dioxide is unloaded out of the blood during external respiration. And so here we see oxygen moving in. Oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, producing oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide moves out. And so when I talk about how carbon dioxide is transported, it's typically transported as a bicarbonate ion. When the bicarbonate ion gets to the lungs, it moves from the blood plasma back into the blood cell, binds to hydrogen, producing carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then breaks down into carbon dioxide and water, and carbon dioxide leaves. So here we have, well, and I just talked about this, but here you see the oxygen binding to the hemoglobin, and that forms the oxyhemoglobin. Some oxygen will dissolve in the blood plasma, but the majority is bound to hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is transported typically as a bicarbonate ion, which I mentioned. And so when it gets into the alveoli, so in the blood vessels next to the alveoli, the bicarbonate has to bind to hydrogen, forming this carbonic acid, which can then dissociate to carbon dioxide and water, and carbon dioxide can leave. And this is just what I just said, so I'll let you, this is also in your notes, so you can read this on your own again, but if this doesn't make sense, you can definitely ask a question to me. So once we get into our tissues, the opposite result occurs, because now we have higher oxygen levels in our blood than in our tissues. So oxygen diffuses out. Oxygen unbinds from hemoglobin and moves out. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, moves in from the tissues to the blood. Carbon dioxide immediately binds to water, producing carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then dissociates into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate. The bicarbonate leaves the blood, moves into the blood plasma, and hydrogen ion enters the blood and binds to the hemoglobin. So there's other factors, or there are different factors that control respiration. We need air in our body, that's a given. If we don't get oxygen to our cells, then there are different regulators of the body that are going to send signals. The signals are sent to the brain. So the brain is what controls our breathing. The major region of the brain that controls breathing is the medulla. This is what sets the basic rhythm of breathing. But also we have the pons, which helps to smooth out our breathing. So the medulla sets the rhythm and has an excitatory and an inhibitory region. The pons smooths out that breathing. So basically, stimuli come in. The stimuli could be carbon dioxide at higher levels, hydrogen ions at higher levels. This is one of the most common. pH changes can also influence breathing. This sends a signal to the medulla. The medulla then is going to increase or decrease. In this case, if we have high levels of carbon dioxide, then we're going to increase breathing to blow off that carbon dioxide. This stimulates the diaphragm to move or to contract, as well as the internal or external intercostals. And the pons then helps to control the smoothness of our breathing. Another indicator would be decreased oxygen, but this is not near as important as high carbon dioxide levels. In fact, our breathing, low levels of oxygen don't really trigger breathing. They only trigger breathing in individuals that have too high of carbon dioxide for too long of periods. So people with emphysema, their oxygen sensors are what are going to dictate their breathing. So typical respiration is about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. Hypercapnia, or I'm sorry, not hypercapnia, hyperpnea is increased respiratory rate. That could be because we need more oxygen. Think of exercising. You have to breathe heavier to get the oxygen to our cells. Other factors, if you have high body temperature, that can go right along with needing more oxygen because of exercise. That could be a reason. Exercise then, of course. This could also be because of a fever. If you're talking or coughing, that can cause you to need more oxygen because you're getting rid of oxygen a lot faster. We have conscious control of breathing. Our diaphragm is skeletal muscle, so we can control breathing to some extent, but we cannot stop breathing just forever. We can't do that. If we stop breathing, we can only hold our breath until we pass out. And at that point, our brain would kick in and make us breathe. So babies that are holding their breath because they're throwing a temper tantrum, you don't have to worry about them dying because they will eventually breathe. Other factors that influence breathing, the most common is carbon dioxide levels. So carbon dioxide is directly correlated with hydrogen ion levels. When we have more carbon dioxide, we also have more hydrogen ions, and that leads us to a lower pH. So low pH increases breathing to get rid of the carbon dioxide to bring our pH back up. I told you that the most important function of the respiratory system is to get oxygen in our body and to get rid of carbon dioxide. One of those reasons is because of pH. So I also mentioned that the respiratory system functions in maintaining pH. And so here's how it does that, or here's why it does that. Because when you have carbon dioxide in your system, your pH becomes more acidic. So we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide, and that brings our pH back to its slightly alkaline environment. To a lesser extent, I mentioned oxygen levels are important. So there are chemoreceptors that will detect differences in oxygen levels, and those are going to stimulate individuals who have too high of carbon dioxide levels already to breathe. So if your system is flooded with carbon dioxide for long periods of time, those receptors become desensitized to the carbon dioxide, and that's why oxygen becomes the driving force for breathing. So hyperventilation is a disorder associated with breathing, and it's usually associated with really high carbon dioxide levels in the blood, often because of some major stressor. And what happens is people start to exhale a lot of carbon dioxide. So they're breathing really, really fast. So they're not getting a lot of oxygen in, but they're pushing a lot of carbon dioxide out. And what happens is they get a very high blood pH, so a very alkaline, above a 7.45 blood pH. This can lead to apnea, so stopping breathing, dizziness, and if not treated, it could lead to alkalosis. Typical treatment for hyperventilation is to put a paper bag around their mouth. So when they're breathing, they're still taking back in that carbon dioxide. So they're not going to have such high levels of, so their blood pH doesn't reach such high levels. I found this, I looked on Google Images, it was really cute, and this is from Pinterest actually, so I love it. So at this point, you should be able to tell me how oxygen is carried as well as how carbon dioxide is carried in the blood, how the medulla and the pons influence gas exchange, what normal respiration rate is, what is hyperpnea, what are physical factors and chemical factors that influence respiration, which has more of an influence on breathing carbon dioxide levels or oxygen levels. So we're talking in a normal, healthy individual. I'm going to stop here. This is a little longer of a video, but we only have about one more video left. So I'll talk to you a little bit. Bye.